90% of the people who hike into the deep woods believe that as long as the sun is shining, they are perfectly safe. But they couldn't be more wrong. There is a terrifying paradox in the Appalachian wilderness. The brighter the day, the deeper the shadows hide. And some of those shadows have been waiting for centuries for someone just like you to step off the trail. Most explorers trust their GPS and their modern gear to act as a shield against the unknown. Yet, there are places in these mountains where physics begins to fray at the edges and logic simply stops working. If you think a map can protect you from what breathes in the hollows, you are making a mistake that could cost you everything. In just a few minutes, I am going to reveal a secret about these ridges that the logging companies and the park rangers have spent decades trying to bury. Are you brave enough to find out why some tracks in the mud lead toward a door but never lead away? Have you ever felt that sudden, inexplicable prickle on the back of your neck while walking through a forest, even though you were sure you were alone? Tell me in the comments if you've ever had a glitch in the woods that you still can't explain today. My name is Elias, and I used to believe in numbers, boundaries, and the absolute authority of a well-drawn map. I was a land surveyor by trade, a man of cold facts and topographical certainties. I lived by the grid and the elevation line, but the summer I turned 23, the world decided to teach me a lesson in humility. It was a year of desperation. The economy had collapsed across our corner of Kentucky like a rotted barn, leaving young men without connections scrambling for any scrap of a paycheck. When Harlan Timber offered me a position cataloging the deep interior of the mountains, I didn't care about the isolation. I cared about the money. I needed that paycheck. It was a hefty one, enough to clear my debts, and then some. I was arrogant back then, convinced that education and a steady hand could conquer any terrain. I spent weeks alone, marking property lines and cataloging timber, growing comfortable with the solitary rhythm of the forest. I enjoyed the silence. I thought the silence was my friend. I didn't realize that in the deep woods, silence isn't an absence of noise. It's a presence that's watching you. Everything changed on a Sunday evening during dinner. My grandfather, Silas, was still alive then, though he was little more than a ghost inhabiting a body ravaged by lung cancer. He usually drifted through the day in a morphine-induced haze, his mind wandering through memories of mine collapses and black bears he had faced down in his youth. He was a man who didn't know the meaning of the word flinch. He was the kind of man who would pull a splinter out with a pocket knife and never blink. But when I mentioned that my next assignment was the Brennan Tract, a deep, bowl-shaped depression locals called Brennan's Hollow, something shifted. His eyes, usually clouded and distant, snapped into a focus so sharp it felt like a physical blow. He reached across the table and seized my wrist. His grip was a topographic anomaly of its own. His fingers, skeletal and thin, dug into my skin with the strength of a drowning man. I can still feel the phantom ache of those bruises today. You stay out of that hollow, Elias, he rasped, his voice a dry rattle of dead leaves. That is cursed ground. It's been wrong since before my own grandfather drew breath. My mother tried to intervene, whispering about the medication and the dreams, but I saw the truth in the lines of his face. It wasn't delirium. It was bone deep, ancestral fear. He told me the stories then, the ones usually reserved for the dark of night when the children are supposed to be asleep. He spoke of the settlement that vanished before the Civil War, an entire community of souls that walked into a single winter and never walked out. No bodies were found, no signs of a struggle, just empty cabins with cold hearths and a silence that moved. He described the trees that grow there, reaching for the sky like supplicants, begging for a mercy that never comes. I nodded. I promised to be careful, but I was a fool. I dismissed it all as mountain superstition. I thought my boots and my compass made me a god in those woods. I told myself, Silas is just old. The cancer is talking. I was so focused on the Harlan Timber deadline that I forgot the most basic rule of the wilderness. Never ignore the person who survived it before you. The morning I set out for the Brennan Tract, the sky was a pale, washed-out blue, the kind that feels like it's been bleached by a fever. It was late August, and the humidity was so thick you could almost chew it. I parked my truck where the logging road disintegrated into deep, axle-breaking ruts, and began the 4-mile trek. The hike started out pleasant, almost mocking in its beauty. Birdsong echoed through the canopy, and the air smelled of pine and damp earth. I was making great time. checking my GPS every 10 minutes, feeling proud of my pace. But as I approached the hollow's edge, the transition hit me like a wall. The temperature didn't just drop, it died. It felt like walking into a meat locker in the middle of a desert. I stepped over a massive, rotted oak that marked the boundary, and the birds went instantly, terrifyingly silent. It wasn't the quiet of a predator nearby. It was a dead silence, an intentional absence of sound, as if the world itself was holding its breath to see if I was stupid enough to keep going. I reached into my bag for my compass, an old family heirloom Silas had insisted I carry. It was a heavy, brass thing, rusted at the hinges but usually reliable. The needle wasn't pointing north. It was spinning in slow, erratic circles, dancing to a magnetic pulse that shouldn't exist. It was a topographic anomaly that defied every textbook I'd ever read. I looked down into the depression of Brennan's Hollow, where the mist clung to the ground like a shroud, and realized that, for the first time in my life, I was standing on ground that no map could ever truly define. I felt a cold pressure in my ears, a warning from the mountain itself. Yet I took that first step into the gray veil. As I descended, the trees began to change. My grandfather hadn't been exaggerating. These weren't normal hardwoods. Their trunks were corkscrewed, winding around themselves like they were trying to escape their own roots. The bark didn't look like wood. It looked like pale, translucent skin stretched tight over bone. There was no undergrowth here, no ferns, no mushrooms, no moss, just a carpet of brown, desiccated leaves that crunched under my boots with the sound of breaking glass. Every step felt heavy, like I was wading through invisible water. I tried to whistle a tune to break the silence, but the air was too thick, and the sound just died in my throat. I felt like a bug in a jar, and something was about to put the lid on. I found the cabin at midday. It was a hand-hewn structure, rotted and gray, its roof partially collapsed, but there was smoke thin, gray wisps of smoke curling up from the chimney. My heart hammered against my ribs. Who would live out here? Why? Every lesson Silas had drilled into me screamed run, but my pride as a surveyor kept me rooted to the spot. I needed to document this. I needed to finish the job. I approached the doorway, which was nothing more than an empty, dark frame. The interior was swallowed in shadows so black they seemed to have weight. And then I saw it, at the window, a figure. It wasn't moving. It was just there. It was a pale blur against the dark glass, a face pressed so close I could see the suggestion of features. But when I looked closer, my stomach turned to liquid. The eyes didn't catch any light. They were just two dark, bottomless pits in a sea of gray skin. It wasn't a squatter. It wasn't a person. It was a watcher, and it was focused entirely on me. I felt the weight of its gaze like a physical pressure on my chest, making it impossible to draw a full breath. I didn't wait to see if it would move. I didn't call it a greeting. I turned and walked. I didn't run. Running invites a chase, but I walked with a purpose I've never felt since. I crested the ridge just as the sun began to dip, and the moment I crossed that rotted oak log, the birds returned. The world regained its color. I drove to the motel, my hands shaking so hard I could barely steer. I tried to tell myself it was a hallucination brought on by the heat and the hunger. I almost convinced myself, but when I stepped out to grab my gear from the truck bed, I froze. There, in the dried mud of the parking lot, were footprints. Small, child-sized footprints. They started at my rear bumper and led in a straight, unwavering line to my motel room door. They were barefoot prints, splayed wide as if the person had never worn shoes in their life. They stopped right at my threshold. There were no prints leading away. I sat in that motel room all night, clutching my survey knife, staring at the door. I watched the handle. It didn't turn, but I could hear it, the soft, rhythmic sound of breathing on the other side of the wood. Something had followed me out of Brennan's Hollow. Something had tracked me for miles, silent and invisible, just to see where I slept. I quit Harlan Timber the next morning. I didn't explain why. I just handed in my equipment and left. I heard later that the tract was marked impassable and abandoned. Harlan Timber went bankrupt shortly after. Some say the land is cursed. I say the land is alive, and it has a very long memory. It's been 15 years, and I live in the city now, surrounded by concrete and streetlights. But some nights, when the air gets still and the fog rolls in from the park, I wake up with a taste of dead leaves in my mouth. I stand at my window, looking down at the street, and I swear I see a small, barefoot figure standing in the shadows, waiting. It's a reminder that once you step into the hollow, you never truly step out. You carry a piece of that darkness with you forever. If you're ever out in the woods and you notice the birds go quiet, or your compass starts to spin, don't be a hero. Don't be like me. Don't worry about the paycheck or the deadline. Just turn around, walk back to your car, and whatever you do, do not look behind you, because if you do, you might see what's been following you since the first step you took. If this story gave you chills, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more Deep Woods encounters. We're building a community of survivors here, and I want to hear your stories. Share this with that one friend who's always trying to go off trail. It might just save their life. Stay safe out there. And remember, the map only shows you where the land is. It doesn't tell you what's living on it. If you think Brennan's Hollow was bad, wait until you hear about the Cavern of Names. It's a place where every visitor finds their name already carved into the stone, along with a date that hasn't happened yet. But that's a story for next time. Are you ready to see what's waiting in the dark? Click the next video to keep going, if you dare. The deformed timber of Brennan's Hollow. The moment my boot touched the soil of Brennan's Hollow, the modern world vanished behind a curtain of unnatural gray mist. It was as if the boundary I had crossed wasn't just geographical, but temporal, a threshold into a place that had long ago forgotten the laws of light and life. The air here was different, heavy, stagnant, and smelling of ancient decay and something metallic, like blood on a rusted blade. I adjusted my pack, the straps digging into my shoulders, and felt the sudden silence of the forest pressing against my eardrums until they rang. Have you ever been in a place where the silence feels like it's actually screaming? That's what it's like in the deep hollows. If you've ever experienced a moment where the birds just stop singing all at once, tell me your story in the comments. I need to know if I'm the only one. My grandfather, Silas, had warned me about this place with a bone-deep terror that should have stopped me. I can still see his skeletal fingers gripping my wrist, his eyes clear for the first time in months. The trees grow wrong down there. Elias, he had rasped. They reach for things that shouldn't be reached for. At the time, I had internally rolled my eyes, attributing his fear to the morphine and the lung cancer. I was 23, educated, and arrogant. I believed that Harlan Timber's survey maps were the ultimate authority. I thought that by cataloging the terrain, I was domesticating it. I was so wrong. I was young enough to think that a degree in civil engineering meant the world had to obey my ruler and my compass. I ignored the ancestral wisdom for a deadline and a paycheck, a mistake I'll be paying for until the day I die. As I descended further into the hollow, the trees began to manifest the very horrors Silas had described. These were not the healthy oaks and maples of the upper ridges. Their trunks were corkscrewed, winding upward in violent, agonizing spirals as if they were trying to screw themselves into the sky. Their bark was the most unsettling part. It was pale, translucent, and stretched thin, looking less like wood and more like human skin pulled taut over muscle and bone. In some places, the bark had split, revealing a dark, weeping sap that looked like dried gore. I reached out to touch a particularly gnarled specimen, but pulled my hand back instinctively. The wood felt warm, not the warmth of the sun, but a low, pulsing heat, like a fever. It felt like touching the skin of someone in the final stages of a sickness. The ground was equally desolate. There were no ferns, no vibrant mosses, no scurrying squirrels, just a thick, suffocating carpet of brown and gray leaves that didn't crunch so much as shatter beneath my boots with the sound of old bones. The topography itself seemed to shift. On my map, the hollow was a simple depression, but as I walked, the slope seemed to steepen, the ridges rising up like the walls of a trap. My breathing became labored, the oxygen feeling thin and insufficient. I felt like I was at the bottom of a massive, ancient throat, and the forest was preparing to swallow. I want you to think about this the next time you go hiking. If the geography around you doesn't match your map, don't keep going. Turn back immediately. In the deep woods, the terrain isn't just dirt and rock. It's an entity. If you find yourself in a place where the trees look like they are suffering, you are already in a territory that doesn't belong to our world. Hit that like button if you've ever felt like the forest was changing its shape around you. By midday, I stumbled upon the cabin. It was a hand-hewn structure of massive logs, many of them rotted through, yet it stood with a defiant, brooding presence. The roof had partially collapsed, and the porch was a graveyard of splintered wood, and yet thin gray smoke was curling upward from the chimney. My heart hammered a frantic rhythm against my ribs. Logic dictated it was a squatter, but instinct told me something far more predatory was inhabiting that space. I stopped, frozen, as the sunlight, which was already dimming despite the hour, seemed to be absorbed by the cabin's dark timber. I checked my watch to gauge how much time I had left before I needed to hike out. The second hand was twitching, stuck in a repetitive, frantic vibration. The time was 11:47 a.m. It stayed 11:47 a.m. for the rest of the day. Time didn't exist in the hollow. There was only the now of being watched. I looked up at the grime-streaked window of the cabin and felt a cold. A sharp blade of panic sliced through my stomach. A figure was standing there. It was pale, nearly the same color as the skin-like bark of the trees, and it remained perfectly still. But it was the eyes that broke my composure. They were void eyes. Dark, bottomless pits that caught absolutely no light. They weren't just pupils. They were absences of existence, fixed on me with an intensity that felt like a physical weight pushing against my chest. I didn't think. I didn't plan. I simply turned and began a retreat that was only steps away from a blind run. Every survival instinct Silas had ever whispered to me came screaming to the surface. Don't run, Elias. Running invites the hunt. I forced myself to walk, with measured, deliberate steps, even as the skin on my back crawled with the sensation of those void eyes tracing my spine. The hike out felt 10 times longer than the hike in. Every corkscrewed tree seemed to lean toward me, their skin bark shivering in a wind I couldn't feel. I could hear my own pulse thundering in my ears, but over that, I heard a second set of footsteps, not synchronized with mine, measured, heavy, barefoot. When I finally crested the ridge and stepped over that rotted oak log, the transition was violent. The birdsong returned in a deafening burst, and the air suddenly tasted of pine and summer heat again. I didn't stop until I reached my truck. I drove back to the motel in a trance, my hands slick with sweat on the steering wheel. I told myself it was the altitude, the isolation, a trick of the light. I was desperate to believe I was still the rational surveyor I'd been that morning. I was begging for a logical explanation, but the hollow doesn't deal in logic. But the hollow wasn't finished with me. As I stepped out of my truck in the motel parking lot to grab my survey bag, I saw them. Small, child-sized footprints pressed deep into the dried mud. They started exactly at my rear bumper and led in a straight, unwavering line across the asphalt to my motel room door. They were barefoot prints, the toes splayed wide, the heels digging in with a heavy, purposeful gait. My blood turned to ice. I looked around the empty parking lot, but there was nothing. No car, no child, no tracks leading away. The prints simply ended at my threshold, as if whatever had made them was currently standing on the other side of the wood. I spent that night sitting in a hard-backed chair, the only light coming from a flickering neon sign outside. I held my survey knife in one hand, my knuckles white. I didn't sleep. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those void eyes. In the middle of the night, the moonlight shifted, casting a long, silver rectangle across the floor. I watched, paralyzed, as the door handle began to turn. It moved slowly, agonizingly so, with a steady, mechanical precision. It didn't rattle. It didn't rush. It just turned until it hit the lock, and then it stopped. A soft, rhythmic breathing sounded from the hallway, a wet, raspy sound that mimicked the cadence of my own breath. Imagine that for a second. You're in a locked room, miles from where you saw that entity, and you realize the lock is the only thing between you and something that followed you home. If you want to hear more about how I survived that night, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell. You do not want to miss the reveal of what happened when I finally opened that door. I quit Harlan Timber the next morning. I didn't give them a reason, and they didn't ask. They had seen that look in the eyes of other men before. My grandfather Silas died 3 weeks later, and at the funeral, A man I didn't know told me I was lucky they let me leave. He was right. It has been 15 years since that summer, and I have moved thousands of miles away to a city that never sleeps. But the trauma is permanent. On the quietest nights, when the city noise fades and the air turns cold, I wake up with the suffocating smell of dead leaves on my tongue. I look at my bedroom door, and for a split second, I expect to see the handle turn. The hollow doesn't just claim land. It claims a piece of your soul, leaving you forever looking for void eyes in the shadows of the streetlights. Here is something you can actually use. If you ever go into the Appalachian backcountry, bring a physical compass and a paper map. If that needle starts to act like a frantic animal, do not hesitate. Leave everything and get out. The fear of missing out on a great photo or a hidden spot is nothing compared to the fear of what happens when the woods decide to keep you. Don't be the person who becomes a story for someone else to tell. So names, I've realized, are better left uncarved, hidden away from the prying eyes of the world. This thought reminds me of a story I once heard about a church that wasn't actually a church. A place where the names of the living and the dead were written in a darkness that no candle could ever hope to pierce. The memory of Brennan's Hollow was just the beginning of my descent into the legends of the Ridge. Would you believe me if I told you that 40 miles to the west, because there is a place where the earth itself keeps a ledger of every soul that has ever walked these mountains? Would you dare to go looking for your own name among the ruins of the legendary Cavern of Names? We are going there next. You won't believe who I found listed on that wall. Stay tuned, because the deeper we go into these mountains, the more you'll realize that some secrets are meant to stay buried, but they always find a way to the surface. Would you dare to look for your own name? Let me know in the comments if you'd take the risk. The Cavern of Living Identity. As the summer sun reaches its peak over the Appalachian ridges, most travelers feel a sense of peace. But I learned the hard way that daylight is just a mask for the ancient things that wait in the shadows. The moment my boot touched the heavy, black soil of Brennan's Hollow, the modern world vanished behind a curtain of unnatural gray mist. It was as if the boundary I had crossed wasn't just geographical, but temporal, a threshold into a place that had long ago forgotten the laws of light and life. The air here was different, heavy, stagnant, and smelling of ancient decay and something metallic, like blood on a rusted blade. I adjusted my heavy pack, the straps digging into my sweat-slicked shoulders, and felt the sudden silence of the forest pressing against my eardrums until they rang. Have you ever been in a place where the silence feels like it's actually screaming at you? That's what it's like in the deep hollows of Kentucky. If you've ever experienced a moment where the birds just stop singing all at once, tell me your story in the comments. I need to know if I'm the only one who felt the world go cold. My grandfather, Silas, who had warned me about this place with a bone-deep terror that should have stopped me in my tracks. I can still see his skeletal fingers gripping my wrist with a strength that defied his cancer-ridden frame. His eyes clear and piercing for the first time in months. The trees grow wrong down there. Hideous, he had rasped, his breath smelling of the hospital and old earth. They reach for things that shouldn't be reached for. At the time, I had internally rolled my eyes, attributing his frantic fear to the morphine and the dreams of a dying man. I was 23, educated, and arrogant. I believed that Harlan Timber's survey maps were the ultimate authority over the wilderness. I thought that by cataloging the terrain, I was domesticating it. I was so wrong. I was young enough to think that a degree in civil engineering meant the world had to obey my ruler and my compass. I ignored the ancestral warning for a deadline and a hefty paycheck, a mistake I'll be paying for until the day I die. As I descended further into the heart of the hollow, the trees began to manifest the very horrors Silas had described. These were not the healthy oaks and maples of the upper ridges. Their trunks were corkscrewed, winding upward in violent, agonizing spirals as if they were trying to screw themselves into the sky to escape the soil. Their bark was the most unsettling part. It was pale, translucent, and stretched thin, looking less like wood and more like human skin pulled taut over muscle and bone. In some places, the bark had split, revealing a dark, weeping sap that looked like dried gore. I reached out to touch a particularly gnarled specimen but pulled my hand back instinctively. The wood felt warm, not the warmth of the sun, but a low, pulsing heat, like a fever. It felt like touching the skin of someone in the final stages of a terrible sickness. The ground beneath me was equally desolate, There were no ferns, no vibran moses, no scurrying squirrels or busy insects, just a thick, suffocating carpet of brown and gray leaves that didn't crunch so much as shatter beneath my boots with the sound of old bones. The topography itself seemed to shift. On my topographic map, the hollow was a simple depression, but as I walked, the slopes seemed to steepen, the ridges rising up like the wooden walls of a trap. My breathing became labored, the oxygen feeling thin and insufficient. I felt like I was standing at the bottom of a massive, ancient throat, and the forest was slowly preparing to swallow. I want you to think about this the next time you go hiking. If the geography around you doesn't match your map, don't keep going. Turn back immediately. In the deep woods, the terrain isn't just dirt and rock. It's an entity with its own intentions. If you find yourself in a place where the trees look like they are in agony, you are already in a territory that doesn't belong to our world. Hit that like button if you've ever felt like the forest was changing its shape around you as you walked. By midday, I stumbled upon the cabin. It was a hand-hewn structure of massive logs, many of them rotted through, yet it stood with a defiant, brooding presence. The roof had partially collapsed on the eastern side, and the porch was a graveyard of splintered wood. And yet, thin gray smoke was curling upward from the chimney, rising in a straight line through the still, windless air. My heart hammered a frantic rhythm against my ribs. Logic dictated it was a squatter, but instinct told me something far more predatory was inhabiting that space. I stopped, frozen, as the sunlight, which was already dimming despite the hour, seemed to be absorbed by the cabin's dark timber rather than reflecting off it. I checked my watch to gauge how much time I had left before I needed to hike out of the shadows. The second hand was twitching, stuck in a repetitive, frantic vibration. The time was 11:47 a.m. It stayed 11:47 a.m. for the rest of the day. Time didn't exist in the hollow. There was only the now of being watched. I looked up at the grime-streaked window of the cabin and felt a cold, sharp blade of panic slice through my stomach. A figure was standing there. It was pale, nearly the same color as the skin-like bark of the twisted trees, and it remained perfectly still. But it was the eyes that broke my composure. They were void, eyes dark, bottomless pits that caught absolutely no light. They weren't just pupils. They were absences of existence, fixed on me with an intensity that felt like a physical weight pushing against my chest. It felt like my very identity was being drained away by that gaze. I didn't think. I didn't plan. I simply turned and began a retreat that was only steps away from a blind run. Every survival instinct Silas had ever whispered to me came screaming to the surface. Don't run, Elias. Running invites the hunt. I forced myself to walk with measured, deliberate steps, even as the skin on my back crawled with the sensation of those void eyes tracing my spine. The hike out felt 10 times longer than the hike in. Every corkscrewed tree seemed to lean toward me, their skin bark shivering in a wind I couldn't feel on my own face. I could hear my own pulse thundering in my ears like a drum. But over that, I heard a second set of footsteps, not synchronized with mine. Measured, heavy, barefoot. I didn't look back. I knew that if I looked back, I would never leave that hollow. When I finally crested the ridge and stepped over that rotted oak log, the transition was violent. The birdsong returned in a deafening burst, and the air suddenly tasted of pine and summer heat again. I didn't stop until I reached my truck. I drove back to the motel in a trance, my hands slick with sweat on the steering wheel. I was begging for a logical explanation, but the hollow doesn't deal in logic. It deals in truth. But the hollow wasn't finished with me. As I stepped out of my truck in the motel parking lot to grab my survey bag, I froze. There, in the dried mud of the parking lot, were footprints. Small, child-sized footprints. They started exactly at my rear bumper and led in a straight, unwavering line across the asphalt to my motel room door. They were barefoot prints, the toes splayed wide, the heels digging in with a heavy, purposeful gait. My blood turned to ice. I looked around the empty parking lot, but there was nothing. No car, no child, no tracks leading away. The prints simply ended at my threshold, right at the crack beneath the door. I spent that night sitting in a hard-backed chair, the only light coming from a flickering neon sign outside. I held my survey knife in one hand, my knuckles white, Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those void eyes. In the middle of the night, the moonlight shifted, casting a long, silver rectangle across the floor. I watched, paralyzed, as the door handle began to turn. It moved slowly, agonizingly so, with a steady, mechanical precision. It didn't rattle. It didn't rush. It just turned until it hit the lock, and then it stopped. A soft, rhythmic breathing sounded from the hallway, a wet, raspy sound that mimicked the cadence of my own breath. Imagine that for a second. You're in a locked room, miles from where you saw that entity, and you realize the lock is the only thing between you and something that followed you home across the mountains. If you want to hear more about how I survived that night, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell. You do not want to miss the reveal of what happened when I finally opened that door the next morning. I quit the logging company the next day. I didn't give them a reason, and they didn't ask. They had seen that look in the eyes of other men before. My grandfather Silas died 3 weeks later, and at the funeral, a man I didn't know told me I was lucky they let me leave. He was right. It has been 15 years since that summer, and I have moved thousands of miles away to a city that never sleeps. But the trauma is permanent. On the quietest nights, when the city noise fades and the air turns cold, I wake up with the suffocating smell of dead leaves on my tongue. I look at my bedroom door, and for a split second, I expect to see the handle turn. The hollow doesn't just claim land, it claims a piece of your soul, leaving you forever looking for void eyes in the shadows of the streetlights. Here is something you can actually use. If you ever go into the Appalachian backcountry, bring a physical compass and a paper map. If that needle starts to act like a frantic animal or spins in circles, do not hesitate. Leave everything and get out. The fear of missing out on a great photo or a hidden spot is nothing compared to the fear of what happens when the woods decide to keep you as a permanent resident. Don't be the person who becomes a story for someone else to tell. Always trust the old-timers when they tell you where not to go. Some names, I've realized, are better left uncarved, hidden away from the prying eyes of the world. This thought reminds me of a story I once heard about a church that wasn't actually a church. A place where the names of the living and the dead were written in a darkness that no candle could ever hope to pierce. Would you believe me if I told you that 40 miles to the west, there is a place where the earth itself keeps a ledger of every soul that has ever walked these mountains? Would you dare to go looking for your own name among the ruins of the legendary Cavern of Names? We are going there next. You won't believe who I found listed on that wall. Stay tuned, because the deeper we go into these mountains, the more you'll realize that some secrets are meant to stay buried, but they always find a way to the surface. Let me know in the comments if you'd take the risk of seeing your own death date carved in stone. Every survivor of the ridge carries a heavy burden of silence. But for me, Julian, that silence became a professional obsession. I've spent the better part of my career as an architectural photographer, focusing on the skeletal remains of rural America. I chased the aesthetic of decay, the rotted porches, the collapsing barns, and the churches that God has long since vacated. I was traveling through a stretch of eastern Kentucky that should have been bustling with small towns. But the reality was a landscape of empty hollers and rusted mobile homes. I was searching for a specific shot, a crooked finger pointing at heaven, when I found the church. It stood at the end of a dirt road that felt like it was growing longer behind me. The steeple was tilted at an impossible angle, and the white clapboard walls were stained with a dark, weeping moisture. But it was the windows that made me stop. They weren't broken. They were intact, but covered in such a thick layer of grime and age that they looked like cataracts on a dying man's eyes. They were opaque, reflecting nothing, but suggesting that something inside was staring back. I stepped out of my car, and the smell hit me, not the rot of the woods, but a heavy, cloying scent of old paper and candle wax. It was the smell of a library buried in a tomb. I entered the sanctuary, my boots leaving clear impressions in a dust so thick it felt like ash. The pews were arranged in perfect, undisturbed rows, as if the congregation had simply vanished mid-hymn. I reached the pulpit, my camera clicking rhythmically, documenting the eerie Protestant modesty that felt entirely unholy. Behind the raised platform, hidden beneath a threadbare rug that smelled of centuries of dampness, I found the trapdoor. It was made of massive oak planks, far older than the church above it, and 2 iron rings were set into the wood. I gripped them, expecting a struggle, but the door came up with a counterweighted ease that made my stomach drop. Below was a darkness that swallowed my professional flash like a thirsty animal. I counted the rungs of the wooden ladder as I descended. 20, 37. I was standing nearly 40 feet beneath a church that had no business having a basement deeper than a few feet. The impossible mathematics of the place hit me first. The foundation above couldn't support a void this deep. I clicked on my high-intensity lantern, and the world shifted. I wasn't in a basement. I was in a natural limestone cavern, the ceiling arching high above me like the ribs of a leviathan. Every inch of the stone was covered. It was a palimpsest of identity, a literal prophecy in stone. Thousands of names were carved into the rock, overlapping, gouged out, or etched with professional precision. Surnames I recognized from local cemeteries were there, but there were other scripts I couldn't read, symbols that looked like they belonged to a pre-human era. I walked deeper into the cave, the air growing colder, the smell of candle wax becoming almost suffocating. My light swept over a smooth section of wall at waist height, and my heart stopped. Margaret Ellen Hoskins, 1919 to 1987. It was my grandmother's name. The dates were correct, down to the day. I had stood at her grave in Lexington, but here she was, her existence claimed by a cavern that no map acknowledged. But the horror didn't stop there. Directly beside her name, carved in a dust so fresh it looked like it was still falling from the stone, was my own name, Julian Vance Hoskins. Below it was a second date, a date only 6 months from today. I didn't take the photo. I didn't wait to see if the stone was still warm. I scrambled up those 37 rungs, the wood groaning beneath my weight, and I didn't stop running until I was back in my car, the tires kicking up a storm of gravel. I told myself it was a hoax, a local prank designed to scare away photographers, but the names were too many, and the cavern was too deep. I tried to find the church on my GPS later that night at the motel, but the coordinates led to a solid mountain ridge with no road in sight. The church, for all intents and purposes, did not exist. The letter arrived. It showed up in my mailbox in Chicago 2 weeks later, a plain white envelope with no return address. Inside was a single, grainy photograph. It was a shot of the cavern wall, lit from below by a light source I hadn't carried. My grandmother's name was visible, and beside it, my name was as clear as a headstone, but in the corner of the frame, reflected in a small pool of water on the cave floor, was a figure, a shadow entity, with no face, standing right behind where I had been kneeling. I haven't slept properly since that letter. I lie awake and listen to the floorboards of my apartment, convinced I hear the rhythmic tapping of a stone chisel. I scan the obituaries every morning, looking for the names I saw on that wall, and every day I find one. A man in Ohio, a teacher in Oregon, a nurse in Florida, all names from the cavern of names, all dead on the dates predicted by the limestone. My own date is approaching. I have started seeing a figure across the street, a silhouette that stays perfectly still in the city shadows, just like the watcher Silas saw in the hollow. I need you to listen closely. If you ever find an abandoned structure that feels like it's exhaling, do not enter. If you find a trapdoor that seems to lead deeper than the building is high, turn around. There are ledgers in this world that we are not meant to read. The fear of missing out on a historical discovery is a lie. The only thing you'll find is your own end. Have you ever found your name somewhere it shouldn't be? A random piece of mail, a carved tree, or a mention in a book you've never read? Tell me in the comments. We need to document these anomalies before the names are all that's left. I'm packing my bags now. Not to run, because I know now that there is nowhere the ridge doesn't reach, noon to go back. Some nights the pull of the stone is so strong I can feel the limestone dust in my lungs. I need to see that wall one more time. I need to know who is carving the names. I need to know if I can cross out the date. Click the like button and subscribe if you want to know what happens when I return to the church. If this is my last video, let it be a warning to all of you. The earth is alive, and it knows exactly who you are. We are all just names, waiting for a date. Do you dare to check the ledger? Let me know. And whatever you do, keep the lights on tonight. The featureless watcher and the mimics cry. Julian burns the photograph in his Chicago apartment, the orange flames licking at the edges of the heavy cardstock until the image of the featureless woman on the ridge curls into black ash. But the physical destruction of the evidence does nothing to stop the psychological infection. The woman in white continues to haunt his dreams, her presence pulling his subconscious back toward Sawyer Ridge with the relentless gravity of a shallow burial plot. This ancestral dread, I've realized, is a shared inheritance among those of us who have stared too long into the Appalachian shadows. While Julian was struggling with the prophecy in stone, others were experiencing a breakdown of reality that was far more auditory and immediate. Some horrors are seen, but the most terrifying are the ones that use your own voice to betray you. Have you ever been in the woods and heard your name called by someone who wasn't there? That is the sound of the mountain taking an interest in you. My name is Leo, and when I was 12 years old, my kingdom was a 40-acre stretch of old-growth hardwood forest on Sawyer Ridge. My father, a stern coal company accountant who usually lived in a world of rigid spreadsheets and cheap whiskey, became a different man at our family cabin. He laughed there. He told stories by the fire. He was human. But the summer of 1998 was the last time I ever saw him smile. It started on a Tuesday evening while I was sitting on the back porch, waiting for the humidity to break. I noticed a movement on the High Ridge Trail. A figure in white. She didn't walk. She glided. It was an unhurried, smooth motion that covered vast distances with a speed that defied the laws of human locomotion. It was a glitch in reality, a frame rate error in the physical world, where her unhurried pace didn't match her actual velocity. I called out to my father, but she was gone before he reached the screen door. She returned every dusk for a week, always at that flickering blue hour when the light fails and the shadows stretch long across the valley floor. On the 7th night, she stopped directly behind our property line. She stood perfectly still, her back to me, framed by 2 skeletal oaks. Slowly, with a mechanical precision that made the hair on my arm stand up, she turned. My blood went cold. Her face was a blank, smooth mask of pale skin. No eyes, no mouth, no nose. Just a featureless mannequin head turned toward me with an attention I could feel vibrating in my very teeth. It was a presence that didn't need eyes to see. I screamed a raw, primal sound, but by the time my father arrived with his rifle, the trail was empty. There were no footprints in the morning, no disturbed brush. Just a dead, suffocating silence. My father stopped making excuses by the end of the 2nd week. He stopped going outside after dark, locking the doors and drawing the curtains before the sun even hit the ridgeline. We left the cabin 3 days early that year, and he sold the land at a loss while I was still in college. I thought we had escaped, that the distance of the city would act as a shield. But years later, after he passed, I found the family albums in the attic. I spent hours with a magnifying glass, and the horror returned. She was there, in every holiday snapshot, every childhood birthday, every candid photo of my grandmother hanging laundry in 1967. There was a white smear at the edge of the frame, a featureless face watching my family for generations, patient beyond any human capacity. Think about your own family photos for a second. Have you ever looked into the background, really looked at the shapes between the trees? If you find a figure that wasn't supposed to be there, hit that like button and share your story. We need to know how deep this infection goes. This breakdown of the familiar, the corruption of one's own history and identity is a hallmark of the Appalachian Ridge. If you think being watched is bad, wait until the mountain starts talking back to you. Using your own vocal cords, shift your focus to the present day, to a man named Marcus, who thought he knew the Blackwater Trail like his own hand. Marcus was an experienced hiker, a man of gear and GPS who didn't believe in mountain ghost stories until his own voice began to hunt him through the timber. It happened on October 14th, a day that started with crisp air and golden leaves. Marcus had reached the 5-mile marker when he encountered a fork in the trail that had never existed on any of his maps. As he stood there, his GPS screen flickered and died. His compass needle began to spin lazily in a circle, refusing to settle on any heading. As the golden light faded into a bruised, sickly gray, the forest went completely silent. No wind, no insects. Marcus, feeling a rising tide of panic, called out, "Hello? Is anyone there?" The answer came from 50 yards ahead, obscured by the dense, dark timber. It was his own voice, not an echo. Echoes don't have that flat, hollow quality of a damaged recording being played back at a slightly lower pitch. The voice repeated his exact words, his exact inflection. "Hello? Is anyone there?" But then it began to change. The mimic started calling his name Marcus. Marcus, a name he hadn't spoken out loud since entering the woods. It came from the left, then the right, then from the darkness directly behind him, a chorus of himself, surrounding him in a predatory circle, mimicking the sound of his own breathing, his own nervous cough. Marcus didn't wait for the reveal. He ran. He crashed through the underbrush, the skin on his arms and face tearing against the briars, while the heavy footsteps of the mimic kept perfect pace with him on either side of the trail. It wasn't the scurrying of a bear or the light tread of a deer. It was the heavy, deliberate thud of something that walked on two legs. He reached his truck in the parking lot just as his headlamp began to fail. He fumbled his keys, threw the truck into gear, and drove away without looking in the rearview mirror. It wasn't until he reached the safety of a well-lit gas station 20 miles away that he saw the driver's side door. 5 parallel scratches were gouged deep into the metal, running from the window frame down to the handle. They were bright, raw silver against the dark paint, too high and too clean to be the work of any animal known to science. The mimic hadn't just been copying his voice. It had been running alongside the truck, trying to peel its way into the cab while he was driving at 40 miles per hour. It was trying to get in. Have you ever heard a voice in the woods that sounded just like someone you knew, only to realize that person was miles away? Or have you found marks on your property that look like fingers trying to pry open a door? If you have, do not ignore them. These aren't accidents. They're invitations. Subscribe now if you want to know the protocol for surviving a mimic encounter, because if you answer the voice, you might not be the one who comes home. The auditory mimicry on Blackwater Trail is a terrifying expansion of the featureless Watcher on Sawyer Ridge. Both entities share an impossible patience and a desire to bridge the gap between the forest and the human world. Marcus still has those scratches on his truck. He refuses to fix them because they are his only anchor to reality. But some evidence is more haunting than others. As the mimic's voice fades into the rustling leaves of your memory, it is often replaced by a different kind of sound. The rhythmic, metallic creak of a swing set in a town that has been dead for nearly a century. The silence of the deep woods is never truly empty. It is a palimpsest of every scream and every song ever uttered in these hollers, waiting for the right frequency to play back. Echoes don't move, but this one was walking toward Marcus, just as the white figure glided toward my family. We are all being tracked by things that catch no light and leave no scent. And if you think a locked door or a city street can save you, you haven't seen the footprints in the dust of Miller Creek. The laughter of ghost children is calling from the ruins of a schoolhouse fire, and we are headed there next, to find out why some playgrounds never grow old, even when the children who played on them have been buried in a mass grave for 76 years. Don't go anywhere. The Song of the Ridge is just getting started, and you don't want to be left behind in the dark. Would you stay to hear the song? Let me know in the comments before the next story begins. The playground of lost echoes. The rhythmic, metallic creak of that swing set on Blackwater Trail didn't just stay in Marcus's ears. It pulled me, Sarah, across 3 county lines to a place that shouldn't exist. I am a documentary filmmaker, and I've built my career on the philosophy that the camera doesn't lie, even when people do. But Miller Creek taught me that sometimes the camera doesn't just lie, it screams in digital static. I found the town on a geological survey map from 1938. A tiny notation in the margin said, "Abandoned 1943. No current population." In the world of urban exploration, that's a siren song. I expected rotted lumber and rusted mining equipment. I didn't expect to find a playground that looked like it had been installed yesterday. The town itself was a corpse. Stone foundations were buried under decades of leaf litter, and chimney stacks rose from the undergrowth like broken teeth. Nature was digesting Miller Creek, floorboard by floorboard. Everything was gray, decayed, and returning to the earth, except for the schoolhouse at the end of the main street. It stood defiant, its wooden frame miraculously preserved, and behind it lay the anomaly. The playground equipment was vibrant, the paint unpeeled, the chains of the swings gleaming as if they had been polished that morning. In a windless hollow where the air was as heavy as lead, the swings were moving in perfect, rhythmic arcs. The merry-go-round was spinning slowly. The painted horses, blurring into streaks of color. The contrast was violent. To my left, a general store had collapsed into a heap of moldering timber. Yet 10 feet in front of me, a bright red slide stood gleaming, devoid of a single speck of rust or even a stray leaf. I felt it then, the weight of attention. It was like standing under a magnifying glass in the sun. I couldn't see anyone, but I knew I was being watched by dozens of eyes from the hollow, roofless ruins. Every hair on my arms stood up. I've been in shuttered asylums and abandoned prisons, places where the air feels thick with history. But this was different. This felt like being an uninvited guest at a party that hadn't stopped since 1943. I set up my professional rig, my heart thudding a frantic beat against my ribs, and began recording. I wanted to capture the movement of the swings, to prove to myself that the wind wasn't doing this. That was when I heard the singing. It was a melody high and thin, a unison of children's voices, following a tune I didn't recognize. There were no words, just a series of rhythmic syllables, an unspoken melody that drifted through the schoolhouse windows like smoke. It was hauntingly beautiful and utterly wrong. I called out, "Is anyone there? I'm just here to film." And the singing stopped instantly. The silence that followed was worse than any scream. The swings stopped mid-arc. The merry-go-round froze. The forest held its breath. I felt a sudden, sharp drop in temperature, the kind that makes your breath hitch in your throat. I didn't wait for a second invitation to leave. I packed my gear in a frenzy, feeling invisible hands brushing against my jacket. I retreated to my truck, my hands shaking so badly I could barely grip the steering wheel or slot the key into the ignition. It wasn't until I got back to my studio in the city, 5 hours away, that the real horror began. I opened the files to review what I thought was the footage of a lifetime. Static. Every single frame was a blizzard of white noise and digital corruption. The audio was a low-frequency hum that made my teeth ache. I was devastated, months of planning gone. I scrubbed through the timeline, desperate for anything salvageable. And then I saw them. For 3 frames less than a tenth of a second, the digital corruption cleared. There, standing, in neat, military rows in front of the schoolhouse, were the children, dozens of them. Their clothes were from the 1,940 seconds, pinafores and suspenders, their faces pale and blurred, and every single one of them had their mouth open in a wide, silent, oh, they were singing directly into my lens. They weren't playing. They were performing. I started digging into the archives of the local county seats. I found a coroner's report from November 1943 that had been buried for 76 years, misfiled in a box of tax records. It detailed a catastrophic fire at the Miller Creek schoolhouse. 34 children, ranging from 6 to 14 years old, had died in the blaze. The report mentioned a structural anomaly that the investigators couldn't explain. The doors had been blocked from the outside with heavy timber and iron bars. It was ruled an accident to avoid a riot, but the mass grave on the outskirts of town, marked only with a single stone slab, tells a different story. Those children didn't just die. They were sacrificed to something the town had become afraid of. I deleted the footage that night. I formatted every SD card and wiped the cloud backups, telling myself I couldn't build a documentary on static and ghost stories. I tried to go back to my normal life, filming architecture and corporate events. But you can't delete a memory once it's been burned into your mind. In my modern city apartment, surrounded by concrete and the hum of traffic, I wake up at 3:00 a.m. to a sound drifting from my hallway. It's that wordless melody, high and thin. I realize now that when I opened those corrupted files, I didn't just view the static, I opened a door. The ghost children of Miller Creek have finally found an exit, and they are using my hallway as their new playground. I hear the sound of small, bare feet running on my hardwood floors. I see the shadows of pigtails on the walls. They aren't looking for help anymore. They're looking for an audience. If you ever find a town that isn't on your modern GPS, or if you see playground equipment moving in a windless field, do not stop. Do not take out your phone to go live. The fear of missing out on a viral video is a trap designed to catch your soul. Some echoes are looking for a new place to ring. And once they find your frequency, they never stop singing. If you've seen things in your camera roll that you don't remember taking, shadowy figures or strange light leaks, do not ignore them. You might have already brought an echo home. Hit that like button if this story gave you chills, and comment below with, "I'm listening," if you've ever heard a voice in your house when you knew you were home alone. We are building a record of the Ridge's reach, one survivor at a time. Do not let their voices go unheard, but do not invite them in. The song of the schoolhouse is fading now, replaced by the heavy, rhythmic breathing that Sarah hears coming from her closet. Across state lines, every survivor of the Ridge is starting to realize the same thing. You can leave the mountains, but the mountains never truly leave you. They are patient, they are old, and they are moving. I'm Julian, I'm Leo, I'm Sarah, and we are all staring at the same creeping shadow in the corner of our rooms. The mountain is moving toward us, and the permission to come inside is the only thing left to be given. Some things don't stay buried in the dirt of Kentucky, and some hitchhikers don't need a car to travel 1,000 miles. Are you ready for the final warning? Because at mile marker 7, the stranger is already waiting for your name to be called. He's standing on the shoulder of the road right now, holding a photograph of your house. If you want to know how to spot him before he spots you, you need to see the conclusion of this journey. The Appalachian legacy is an inheritance of blood and shadow, and your name might just be the next one carved into the stone. Stay tuned. Keep your doors locked, and whatever you do, don't answer the knocking. It's never who you think it is. The inheritance of the Ridge, the song of the schoolhouse is fading now, replaced by the heavy, rhythmic breathing that Sarah hears coming from her closet. Across state lines, every survivor of the Ridge is starting to realize the same thing. You can leave the mountains, but the mountains never truly leave you. They are patient, they are old, and they are moving. I'm Julian, I'm Leo, I'm Sarah, and we are all staring at the same creeping shadow in the corner of our rooms. The mountain is moving toward us, and the permission to come inside is the only thing left to be given. Some things don't stay buried in the dirt of Kentucky, and some hitchhikers don't need a car to travel 1,000 miles. We all believed that the concrete of the city, the glare of the streetlights, and the digital hum of our modern lives would act as a barrier. We were wrong. The urban landscape hasn't saved us. It has only given the Appalachian legacy a new set of walls to haunt. There is a profound futility in trying to escape a place that has already claimed your identity. For me, Julian, the city of Chicago has become a cage of glass and steel, where the shadows feel more deliberate. I opened my desk drawer yesterday to find a new photograph, one I never took. It shows the same stretch of road at mile marker 7, but the figure with the void for a face is no longer standing at the edge of the forest. He is standing on the yellow line, looking directly at the lens. I realized then that the stranger doesn't just want a ride. He wants a destination. Every one of us who stepped off the trail or looked into the sealed well has brought back an uninvited guest. We hear the breathing in the closets at night, a wet, raspy sound that mimics the air in our own lungs. We find the photographs appearing in our phones, grainy shots of us sleeping taken from the foot of the bed. The Appalachian legacy isn't just a collection of ghost stories. It is a living, breathing inheritance of blood and shadow. The mountains don't just hold secrets. They hold people. They hold the children of Miller Creek, the names in the limestone cavern, and the featureless woman of Sawyer Ridge. And now, they hold us. The symptoms are universal among those who have stared into the Ridge's eyes. The sudden drop in room temperature, the feeling of being watched by something that catches no light, and the growing realization that our homes are no longer our own. We are all waiting for the same inevitable moment when the knocking at the door isn't a neighbor or a friend, but the mountain finally asking for what it's owed. This is the final warning for anyone who thinks the deep woods are just a playground for the adventurous. Some things keep watching until they are invited in, and sometimes just looking is the only invitation they need. If you've ever felt that sudden, sharp urge to look behind you while driving a lonely highway at night, do not look. If you see a small, barefoot figure standing in the shadows of a city street, do not approach. The mountain is moving, and the distance between the Ridge and your front door is getting shorter with every breath you take. We are the inheritance of the Ridge, a collective of souls bound by a trauma that has no expiration date. I'm Julian, I'm Leo, I'm Sarah, and we are just names waiting for a date to be carved. You see, the Appalachian Ridges have a way of swallowing the boundary between what is and what was. We thought we were survivors, but in reality, we are just carriers. We are the vessels through which the ancient hollows reach into the modern world. Every time I close my eyes, I'm back at the edge of that sealed well. I can still hear my grandmother's voice, or the thing that stole it, whispering that the concrete cap was never meant to keep something in, but to keep us from seeing how much of the earth has already been replaced by shadow. And what about David Michael Patterson? He thought he was just being a good Samaritan at mile marker 7. He's a man who burns every photograph he finds in his house. Yet the pile of ash in his fireplace keeps growing. The stranger with the void for a face is no longer on the mountain road. He's in David's guest room, sitting perfectly still, waiting for the sun to go down so he can speak David's full name one more time. That is the true weight of the Appalachian legacy. It's not just a story you hear. It's a name you can't stop answering. If you're still listening, I want you to perform a simple test tonight. Before you go to sleep, take a photo of the foot of your bed. Don't look at it until the morning. If you see a shadow that doesn't match the furniture, or a pale blur near the edge of the frame, do not panic. Panic is what they feed on. Instead, write, "I do not give permission" in the comments below. Let's see how many of us are actually being tracked right now. We are building a community of survivors, but we are also building a map of the shadows. Hit that like button if you've ever felt a cold hand on your shoulder in a room you knew was empty. Subscribe to keep following our record of the ridge, because the next update might be the one that saves your life. The reality is that these mountains are more than just geography. They are a living memory, a palimpsest of every soul that has ever vanished into the mist. We are the latest entries in a ledger that began before the Civil War. We are the echoes of Miller Creek, the skin bark of Brennan's Hollow, and the featureless glide of Sawyer Ridge. We are the ridge itself. And as the city lights flicker and the digital world glitches, we realize the ultimate truth. The hills don't have eyes because they don't need them. They have us. Do you still think you're safe because you live in a city? Do you still think a map can protect you? Logic tries to ignore the scratching in the walls. But logic doesn't have to sleep. The mountains are patient. They have waited a century for the children of Miller Creek to find an exit, and they will wait a century for you. The permission to enter is the only thing left. Will you give it? Or will the mountain take it anyway? Stay safe, because the shadows are already inside, and they are tired of waiting. Remember, if you hear your own voice calling from the hallway, do not answer. It's not you. It's the ridge, and it has finally come home. The silent predator of the peaks. Did you know that 90% of the people who go missing in the deep wilderness of the Appalachian Mountains are never heard from again? There's a chilling secret that the frost-covered peaks of West Virginia keep, a silence that swallows screams whole. And in 2026, those ancient shadows are growing hungrier than ever. If you have ever felt the hair on the back of your neck stand up while walking through a silent forest, or felt a gaze from the darkness that didn't belong to any animal, you know exactly what I'm talking about. But what happens when that gaze follows you back to the one place you're supposed to be safe? I still think about that trip more often than I wish I did. It was supposed to be a harmless winter escape, the kind of trip where a group of old friends rents a family cabin in the West Virginia highlands before the ski season fully kicks in. The goal was simple: unwind, disconnect, and make the kind of dumb memories that only matter to people who have known each other for 20 years. My friend Julian, the guy who had been like a brother to me since grade school, had a family cabin that had been passed down through generations. It was tucked high above a tiny mountain town, surrounded by ridgelines that felt peaceful during the day, but suffocatingly narrow once the sun dipped below the crest. Julian always spoke about the place as if it were a sacred space where nothing bad could ever happen, a sanctuary of cheap beer and bad skiing. We arrived late on a Thursday evening, the air already thick with the scent of pine and the promise of a storm. We were stupidly overconfident. We were the kind of guys who didn't bother checking weather updates because we thought we knew the mountains better than the meteorologists did. Our phones had been pinging with notifications since we hit the state line, but we were too busy laughing to look. Only later did I realize how irresponsible we had been, ignoring a weather advisory that explicitly stated everyone in the region should stay indoors. A heavy Appalachian winter storm was coming, and it was coming fast. The morning started out harmless enough. The sky was that bright, clinical blue that makes everything look sharper and colder. By noon, however, the mood shifted. I took a clumsy landing on a small slope behind the cabin, and a sharp, white-hot pain shot through my ankle. I knew immediately I had messed something up. It wasn't just a sprain. There was a bone-grinding pain that made every step feel like my skeletal structure was slightly out of place. I told Julian and the others to keep going. The cabin roof was still visible through the patches of trees, and I figured I could limp back in 40 minutes if I didn't push it. I'd make some tea, rest my foot, and wait for them to return. When I reached the cabin, I locked the door behind me. I did it out of habit, not fear, but the silence inside felt heavier than usual. It was as if the storm was already pressing its weight against the log walls long before the first snowflake touched the ground. I spent an hour limping around the kitchen, trying to find where Julian kept the aspirin, opening cabinets and closets, just to distract myself from a growing sense of unease. I wasn't used to being this isolated. The nearest neighbor was miles away, and the cell signal was a fickle thing that came and went like a ghost. Julian had the satellite phone in his pack, leaving me with a regular cell that showed no service more often than not. Then the snow began to fall hard. It wasn't a gentle dusting. It was a thick, vertical curtain that erased the tree line in minutes. An hour passed. Then another. I watched the light fade behind the shadowed ridgeline, the forest growing darker and more predatory with every passing second. I tried calling them, texting, holding my phone in the corner of the kitchen where Julian said he sometimes caught a bar, but nothing went through. The wind started to howl, a low, a mournful sound that made me keep glancing at the windows, imagining shapes moving between the swirling white flakes. I was sick with worry. My mind kept cycling through scenarios of Julian and the guys lost in the whiteout, freezing as the temperature plummeted. My phone buzzed. It was a rushed message from Julian that must have caught a stray signal. They were caught in the storm and had been forced to descend toward the town instead of trying to climb back to the cabin. They were safe, but I was going to be alone for the night. Julian included a list of cabin basics, where the firewood was, how to toggle the backup generator, and where the emergency blankets were hidden. Knowing they were safe should have calmed me, but instead, it made the cabin feel cavernous. Every creak of the floorboard sounded like a footstep. I made sure every window was latched and lowered the heavy wooden shutters. I started a fire in the hearth, but I had miscalculated the wood pile. The logs Julian had brought in earlier were small, and they burned through much faster than I expected. I knew how quickly a cabin turns into a freezer once the fire dies, and with the storm building into a relentless beast outside, I couldn't afford to let the hearth go cold. I had to go to the woodshed. The shed was only 30 feet from the back door, but the moment I stepped out, the wind hit me like a physical shove. The Appalachian frost was so sharp it felt like it was peeling the skin off my face. I kept my head down, my flashlight beam reflecting off the swirling snow and blinding me. I reached the shed, a crooked outbuilding that looked like it was held together by prayer and old paint. I shoved the door open, stepped inside, and breathed a sigh of relief as the wind died down. I filled my pack with as many heavy oak logs as I could handle, counting to 50 in my head to keep my focus. But when I turned to leave, my stomach dropped. The snow outside the shed door was no longer smooth. There were footprints, deep, fresh, and heavy. They weren't mine. I froze, my breath fogging so thick it felt like I was hyperventilating into a mask. I stepped back into the shed and eased the door shut, sliding a rusted latch into place. My heart was pounding so violently I could feel the pulse in my fingertips. These footprints were too large for a normal man, spaced out in a deliberate, slow walk. There was no reason for anyone to be out here. No neighbors, no hikers. No one who meant well would be prowling around a remote cabin in a blizzard without calling out for help. I lowered myself to a small, cracked window in the back of the shed. Through the white blur, a shape emerged. It was a man dressed head to toe in black winter gear. He wore a headlamp that cast a pale, sickly circle of light on the cabin's rear window. He wasn't knocking. He wasn't shouting. He was testing the window frame, his fingers moving methodically along the wood as if checking for a structural weakness. He never once looked up, his focus entirely on getting inside the house where he thought I was sleeping. I realized then that if he had seen me walk out to the shed, he knew I was trapped in this thin-walled outbuilding. My skin crawled at the thought of those methodical fingers finding the shed door next. I had to get back to the cabin. I looked around the shed frantically, looking for a weapon, but all I had were the logs in my pack. Then I saw a second door, half hidden behind a stack of loose planks, a back exit Julian had never mentioned. My hands were shaking so badly I dropped the key the first time, tears of pure frustration stinging my eyes. On the third try, the lock turned. I stepped out into the blinding white, the wind swallowing the sound of my footsteps. I didn't look back until I reached the porch. When I finally turned, I saw the headlamp jerk toward me. He saw me. He didn't hesitate. He broke into a dead run, his black-clad figure cutting through the snow with terrifying speed. I threw myself into the cabin, slammed the door, and locked it. I dragged everything I could reach a heavy dresser, a bench, a coat rack prowling with a strength fueled by pure, unadulterated panic. I could hear him now. The impact of his weight hitting the door made the entire frame rattle. I knew a barricade of furniture wouldn't hold forever against someone that determined. I remembered Julian mentioned a handgun he kept for protection. I scrambled to the fireplace and reached under the high mantel, my fingers closing around the cold steel of a 9mm. I didn't think. I didn't wait. I pointed the barrel at the ceiling and fired a single round. The explosion of sound in that small room was deafening. My ears rang, and for a moment, the world went silent. The hitting stopped. The wind continued to rage outside, but the scratching at the door was gone. I sat on the floor with my back against the couch, the gun resting on my lap, feeding the fire whenever it dipped. I didn't dare move the barricade or open a shutter. I just listened to the storm, wondering if those methodical eyes were still watching from the tree line, waiting for the fire to go out again. The police arrived at 2. The next day with Julian and the guys, they investigated the footprints, the marks on the door, and the broken shed latch. But the storm had done its job. It had erased the trail. Julian kept saying that in all the generations his family owned the place, nothing like this had ever happened. But as we drove away that evening, I looked back at the shadowed ridgeline and realized the mountains don't care how long you've owned a piece of dirt. They have their own residents, and sometimes those residents decide they want what's inside. The silence of the peaks is never truly empty. It's just a mask for the things that walk when the snow begins to fall. While I managed to escape that methodical predator, others have found themselves in much more intimate contact with the strange residents of these woods, the Monongahela stalkers. The silence of those peaks is never truly empty. It is just a mask for the things that walk when the snow begins to fall. While I managed to escape that methodical predator at Julian's cabin, others have found themselves in much more intimate contact with the strange residents of these woods, and few regions harbor as much local dread as the Monongahela National Forest. If you have ever hiked into the deep woods and felt a prickle on your skin like 1,000 tiny needles, pay attention, that is. Your survival instinct screaming at you. It was early November, the kind of transitional period where the Appalachians trade their vibrant autumn colors for a skeletal, gray ocean valley. My girlfriend, Sarah, and I had planned this trip for months. I wanted to give her a real taste of the wilderness, away from the city lights and the constant hum of technology. I've been camping since I was a kid, so I felt a misplaced sense of security. I believed I knew how to read the trees, but the Monongahela shadows play tricks on even the most experienced eyes. Have you ever wondered why some trails feel welcoming and others feel like they are actively trying to push you out? This was the latter. The hike started with an almost surreal happiness, but in hindsight, it felt like the calm before a devastating storm. Sarah looked radiant, her face lit by the crisp mountain air. Laughing as we navigated the rocky terrain, we parked near an old service road that looked like it hadn't seen a tire in decades, overgrown with thorns and reclaimed by the earth, and began our ascent. The trail was narrow, flanked by trees that seemed to lean in as if listening to our conversation, their leafless branches clawing at the sky. About an hour in, I caught a flicker of movement far down the trail behind us. I stopped, pretending to adjust the straps on my pack, my heart beginning a slow, heavy thud. A shape was there, standing perfectly still. It wasn't approaching, just existing in the middle of the path. At first, I told myself it was a tree stump or a trick of the stretching shadows. You see what you want to see in the woods, and I desperately wanted to see a peaceful, empty trail. But when I looked a second time, after a quick blink to clear my vision, the shape was gone. There was no sound of a retreat, no snapping of branches, just an empty trail. I didn't tell Sarah. I didn't want to poison the moment with my own paranoia, but that was my first mistake. If you're out there and you see something that makes your blood run cold, tell your partner immediately. Don't play the hero. We reached a clearing near a massive, rotting fallen log and set up camp as the sun dipped behind the ridges, turning the world into a bruised purple gloom. That's when the atmosphere shifted completely. The silence of the forest changed from peaceful to predatory. I felt an extra weight of responsibility, a primal need to protect Sarah that made every snap of a twig sound like a gunshot echoing through the gray ocean valley. Throughout the evening, while we tried to eat our freeze-dried meals, I found myself staying too alert, my eyes darting toward the tree line, noticing small deviations in the pattern of the woods that I couldn't quite explain. That night was a slow, agonizing erosion of sanity. I kept waking up to sounds that didn't belong to the local fauna. It wasn't the rhythmic, heavy pacing of a deer or the frantic, chaotic scurrying of a raccoon. These were selective steps, slow, heavy, and deliberate, as if someone was testing the density of the leaves before committing their full weight. Every time I peeked through the tent mesh, my breath fogging the screen, I saw only the black silhouettes of the trees swaying in the wind, but the feeling of being watched by something sentient never left. It was a pressure in the air, a localized heaviness. In the morning, the disturbances became undeniable and chillingly personal. Sarah noticed it first, and her scream is something I still hear when I close my eyes. Her water bottle, which she distinctly remembered, placing deep inside her pack's side pocket and zipping up, was sitting perfectly upright on the fallen log outside the tent. But that wasn't the worst part. Our food bag, which I had hung high on a branch using a complex bear hang knot, was angled differently. When I lowered it, I saw smudge marks of dirt and grease on the fabric, not from a bear's claws, but from human fingers. Someone had been inside our perimeter, standing over us while we slept, inspecting our belongings like they were deciding what to take. The subtle reality that someone had been inches away from our sleeping heads hit me like a physical blow to the stomach. I told Sarah we should probably move on, trying to keep my voice steady, but my hands were shaking as I folded the tent. I could see the change in her eyes. The light was gone, replaced by a sharp, jagged fear that made her move in stiff, robotic motions. We hiked deeper into the forest, foolishly thinking that putting miles between us and that campsite would bring safety. Instead, the sensation of a double silhouette following us only intensified. The Monongahela shadows seemed to lengthen, even at noon. At one point, I turned fast, catching a glimpse of them through a break in the pines, two shapes far down the trail, ducking behind trunks the moment I made eye contact. I didn't wait this time. I pulled Sarah behind me, my knuckles white as I gripped the handle of my knife, and yelled into the void. I claimed we were armed, that we had people expecting us, and that they needed to leave us alone. There was no response, no shouting back, no mocking laughter, just that same oppressive silence that was more terrifying than a direct threat would have been. If someone is following you and they won't speak, they aren't looking for conversation. They are looking for a moment of weakness. By mid-afternoon, the tension was so high that Sarah was hyperventilating. We decided to backtrack, a decision that felt like walking into a trap, but we had no choice if we wanted to reach the car. The return hike was a brutal gauntlet of psychological warfare. Every time we rounded a bend, I expected to see them standing in the middle of the path. As the light began to fail and the temperature dropped, we realized with a sinking horror that we wouldn't make it to the car before total darkness. We found a spot near a cluster of boulders that offered a natural wall that could reel back, a defensive position that felt like a last stand. While we were setting up, the wind died down for a split second, and Sarah froze mid-step, her face straining of all color. She pointed a trembling finger toward a cluster of oaks. Between two trunks, I saw him clearly for the first time. A tall, thin man standing upright like a dead, charred tree. He wore a tattered coat and a hat pulled so low you could only see the glint of his eyes. And then, a few yards to his left, a broader, heavier man stepped out from behind a rock. They didn't even bother to hide anymore. They just stood there at the edge of the clearing, 20 yards away, watching us with a chilling, vacant intensity. They looked like they had been living in those woods for years, part of the gray ocean valley itself. We spent that entire night in a state of living death. Sarah was huddled in the far corner of the tent, her quiet, rhythmic sobbing muffled by her heavy winter jacket. I sat at the entrance, the weight of the handgun I'd brought just in case, feeling impossibly heavy and alien in my lap. I had never pointed a gun at a human being, and the internal struggle between my civilized mind and the primal, desperate urge to keep Sarah alive was tearing me apart. We were both drenched in cold sweat despite the freezing Monongahela air. Several times throughout the night, I saw their shadows move across the tent fabric as they paced the perimeter. I yelled, I cursed, I threatened to fire. They never said a word. They just stayed at the edge of our flashlight's reach, two sets of eyes reflecting the dim light like predators. Sunrise brought a pale, sickly light to the valley, and when I looked out, they were still there, leaning against the boulders like they were waiting for a bus. My whole body ached from the adrenaline-fueled tension. I had convinced myself they would leave by dawn, that the light would chase them away, but their ancient patience was unbreakable. They were waiting for me to fall asleep. They were waiting for us to make one mistake. Just as I felt my resolve beginning to snap, just as I was considering firing a warning shot, the sound of distant, rhythmic shouting broke through the trees. The two men glanced at each other, shared a look that I can only describe as disappointed, and bolted into the thick brush with a speed and agility that felt entirely inhuman. They didn't run like people. They moved like animals that knew every root and stone. 5 park rangers emerged from the trail a few minutes later, their orange vests, the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. I practically collapsed with relief, sobbing alongside Sarah as the rangers reached our camp. We thought the nightmare was over, but the real horror was just beginning. The twist came when the lead ranger knelt down and asked if we had seen anyone else. They weren't looking for us. They were in the middle of a massive SAR operation for a group of 3 college students who had gone missing from a nearby trail 48 hours earlier. The rangers were on high alert, their hands never far from their sidearms. They escorted us out, taking us to the local hospital to treat us for severe shock and dehydration. 3 days later, while we were recuperating in a motel, the news broke. 2 of the missing students had been found. They were discovered miles away, shivering and terrified, hiding in the back of a deep, damp cave. They told a story that sent chills down my spine. It was a mirror image of our own. They had been stalked for miles, watched while they slept, and chased through the gray ocean valley by 2 men they couldn't identify. But then the anchor's voice dropped. The third friend, the young man who had been with them when the stalking began, was never found. The search was eventually called off due to a massive blizzard, leaving him as another unresolved disappearance in the Monongahela. To this day, that third friend remains a ghost. The case went cold, and those 2 men were never identified or captured. They are still out there, somewhere in the deep, unmapped folds of the Monongahela National Forest, blending into the shadows and waiting. If you're planning a hike this winter, I have one piece of advice. Don't go alone. And for the love of everything, don't ignore that feeling that the trees are watching you, because in these mountains, they usually are. Leave a comment below if you've ever felt that wrong energy in the woods. Did you stay, or did you run? Trust your gut, because the Monongahela doesn't give second louis. This realization that the most dangerous predators in the woods aren't always animals or even hidden in the deep forest is a lesson I would carry with me into a much more urban setting. Even when you are surrounded by the supposed safety of civilization, the same predatory intent can follow you home, waiting for a moment of true isolation. If you think your locked front door is enough to keep the darkness out, think again. In the next story, we see what happens when the stalker doesn't stay in the woods, but follows you right into your own bedroom. The freezer room trap. This realization that the most dangerous predators in the woods aren't always animals or even hidden in the deep forest is a lesson I would carry with me into a much more urban setting. Even when you are surrounded by the supposed safety of civilization, the same predatory intent can follow you home, waiting for a moment of true isolation. If you think your locked front door is enough to keep the darkness out, think again. The transition from the Monongahela wilderness to the rolling slopes of the Blue Ridge Mountains didn't offer the sanctuary I expected. I was working the night shift at a gas station, a lonely fluorescent island surrounded by a sea of black pines. My name is Marcus, and back then, I lived in a house so remote that my only consistent companion was my cat. Have you ever felt that sinking feeling when you realize you're not as safe as you thought? And that was the night my sense of security shattered forever. The shift had been grueling. 30 a.m. The air was biting, crystalline cold that seemed to freeze the breath in your lungs the moment you stepped away from the space heater. I was counting down the minutes, watching the steam rise from my coffee, When a man walked in, he didn't look like a hiker or a local traveler. He was disheveled, but his eyes were too bright, too focused. He started with small talk, but it quickly spiraled into something invasive. He made comments about my build, about my body, his voice dripping with a calculated, oily charm. When I told him I wasn't interested, his demeanor shifted from flirtatious to aggressive. He reached across the counter and clamped his hand around my wrist. His grip was cold, a predatory harassment that sent a jolt of adrenaline through me. I didn't hesitate. I reached for the handgun I kept under the register. He smiled a slow, yellowed grin and walked out without a word. I tried to shake it off. I was bigger than him, and I was armed. I've lived in these mountains my whole life, and I know how to handle creeps. But as I walked to my car 45 minutes later, I noticed a white work van idling at the edge of the lot. Its lights off, a silent observer in the dark. I didn't think much of it until I was halfway through my hour-long commute. The visibility was near zero, a thick Appalachian fog clinging to the road like wet wool, distorting the shapes of the trees into monsters. I didn't see any headlights behind me, but I had this prickling sensation on the back of my neck. Have you ever felt like you were being followed by a shadow? I didn't see a car, but I felt a presence. It's a primal instinct, something we inherited from our ancestors to survive. If you ever feel it, do not ignore it. When I finally pulled into my driveway and hurried inside, all I wanted was a hot shower to wash off the grime of the shift and the grease of that encounter. I was standing under the spray, letting the steam clear my head, when I heard it, a sharp, distinct crash from downstairs. It sounded like a porcelain vase hitting the hardwood. I froze, the water drumming against my back like 1,000 cold fingers. My first thought was Mia. She's a curious cat, but she's not clumsy. I stayed silent for minutes, listening, the silence of the house suddenly feeling predatory. When I finally stepped out and wrapped a towel around myself, I saw Mia. She was in the bathroom with me, her back arched, her fur a puffed up mess of terror. She was staring at the closed bathroom door, a low, guttural growl vibrating in her throat. I realized then that the sound hadn't been an accident. I dressed quickly, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. As I descended the stairs, the air in the house felt different, heavy, occupied, and smelling faintly of the winter damp. At the bottom of the steps, I found the broken vase, shattered into 100 jagged pieces, and then I saw them. A pile of clothes, dirty and smelling of road salt, neatly folded on the couch. I didn't need to see his face to know who was in my house. The harasser from the station hadn't just followed me. He'd arrived before me, waited for me to be vulnerable, and was now somewhere in my home, completely naked. The level of premeditated violation was enough to make my stomach turn. He wasn't just a creep. He was a hunter. I felt a surge of cold fury that overrode my fear. I knew I couldn't just have a shootout in my own living room. Not with Mia there. I needed a plan, and I needed it fast. I suffer from chronic migraines, the kind that feel like a railroad spike through the temple, and because of that, I had converted a small, windowless storage room into a sensory deprivation chamber. It was a stimulus-free sanctuary where I could retreat from light and sound. The door was heavy, solid oak with a high-quality deadbolt. It was the perfect trap. I grabbed Mia, whispering to her to stay quiet, and headed for the bedroom where I kept my gun. I knew he was there before I even saw him. The closet door was a fraction of an inch ajar, a sliver of darkness where there should have been none. I saw a slight shift in the shadows inside. He was waiting for me to climb into bed, waiting for me to fall asleep so he could catch me at my most vulnerable. I didn't give him the chance. I used the divide and conquer strategy. I pretended to be on the phone with a friend, loudly announcing that they would be at my house in 10 minutes to drop off some hiking gear. It was a gamble, but I needed to lure him toward the storage room, or at least keep him contained. I grabbed my comforter, my phone, and most importantly, the remote for the industrial strength AC unit I had installed in the storage room for my migraine sessions. I managed to lure him out, his naked form, a pale, grotesque specter in the hallway. I didn't engage. I moved, with a speed born of pure adrenaline. I backed out toward the storage room, acting like I was retreating in fear. The second he stepped near the threshold, I shoved him with everything I had. He stumbled into the darkness, I slammed the heavy storage door shut and turned the deadbolt. The click of the lock was the most satisfying sound I've ever heard. He was trapped in a windowless box. I walked to the thermostat and clicked the air conditioning to its maximum setting, a bone-chilling sub-zero blast. It was the dead of winter, and the room was tiny. Within 5 minutes, that stimulus-free room would become an icebox. I sat on the kitchen floor with Mia, the gun in my hand, and waited. Have you ever wondered what sub-zero justice feels like? I was about to find out. It didn't take long for the screaming to start. He went from begging for mercy, his voice cracking with the cold, to howling like a wounded animal as the freezing air began to sap the heat from his skin. He was naked, trapped in total darkness, and the temperature was dropping into the negatives. I sat there, listening, feeling a dark sense of satisfaction. If you ever find yourself in a situation where you can outsmart a predator, do not hesitate. Use your environment. Turn their confidence against them. I waited exactly 33 minutes before the police arrived. I wanted him to be so cold he couldn't even put up a fight. I wanted the fight to be drained out of him by the Appalachian frost. When the officers opened that door, they found a shivering, blue-lipped predator curled in a fetal position, looking like he had seen a ghost. The older officer actually laughed when I explained the setup. He told me it was the most creative self-defense he'd seen in 20 years on the force. The trial is still ongoing, and let me tell you, justice is a slow process. But every time I see him in that courtroom, I see the slight tremble in his hands when he looks at me. He isn't the hunter anymore. He's the one who realized that some people have a way of turning the darkness against you. This psychological warfare didn't just save my life. It ensured he would never have the courage to harass anyone ever again. I turned my sanctuary into his prison, and I don't regret a single second of it. If you want to know how to protect yourself in remote areas, my first piece of advice is always have a plan. Know your home's layout better than any intruder ever could. If you enjoyed hearing how I turned the tables on this creep, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories of survival. What would you have done in my position? Let me know in the comments. But while I could lock my door against a human creep and use technology to defeat him, there are things in these mountains that don't need a door to get in. There are legends in the Appalachians that aren't just stories, they are warnings. Sometimes the threat is built into the very foundation of the house, hidden in places we've tried to seal away and forget. In the next story, we explore a cabin where the intruder discovered that the living owners are the least of your worries when the attic has a mind of its own. If you think a naked man in your closet is scary, wait until you hear what was waiting for the thief who broke into the cursed cabin on the ridge, the attic's guardian. But while I could lock my door against a human creep and use technology to defeat him, there are things in these mountains that don't need a door to get in. Sometimes, the threat is built into the very foundation of the house, hidden in places we've tried to seal away and forget. My friend Silas recently learned that lesson the hard way, in a remote cabin perched on a wind-whipped ridge. Have you ever entered a room and felt like the air was already occupied? Like the space didn't want you there? That is the Blue Ridge way of telling you to turn around. It was a violent storm that night, the kind where the clouds seemed to physically collide with the granite peaks, making every ancient tree groan, and the cabin's seasoned log walls feel as flimsy as wet cardboard. Silas was alone, nursing a glass of whiskey, listening to the wind howl through the eaves like a pack of starving wolves. He was trying to enjoy the isolation, but the Appalachians have a way of turning quiet into ominous in a matter of seconds. The first knock came at exactly 11. Under PM? It wasn't a gentle rap. It was a solid, rhythmic thud on the front door that vibrated through the floorboards. Silas frozen. Out here, on a ridge accessible only by a four-wheel drive in good weather. You don't get visitors at midnight during a blizzard. He pulled up his security feed on his phone, but the screen showed only gray, static and swirling white. The storm had effectively blinded his electronic eyes. When he peered through the physical peephole, his heart hammering against his ribs, there was nothing but the dark, freezing void. No footprints, no shadow, just the screaming wind. He retreated to the kitchen, his hand trembling as he set his glass down. That's when it happened. A pale, unsettling mask was suddenly pressed flat against the kitchen glass, a frozen, plastic face with hollow eyes staring in from the blizzard. It didn't move. It didn't blink. It just watched. Silas didn't know it then, but he was caught in a terrifying crossfire between a living predator and a dead one. You see, That cabin had a history that the realtor conveniently forgot to mention. The locals in the valley spoke of a vengeful spirit, a shadow that had terrorized the previous owners until they were driven to madness. In a desperate attempt to reclaim their home, they had the attic literally sealed with a thick layer of industrial cement. They lined the floorboards with salt and silver, trapping the entity in the dark, windowless void above the ceiling. But every prison has a weakness, a crack in the armor. For this cabin, it was the one unsealed roof window, a tiny, overlooked pane of glass meant for ventilation that the cement crew had missed. The masked intruder outside didn't know about the attic's silent occupant. He saw Silas as an easy target in an isolated cabin. Silas watched as the mask pulled away from the window, and a moment later, he heard the heavy scraping of boots on the exterior logs. The man was climbing toward the roof to bypass the barricaded doors. Silas stood in the hallway, his grip tightening on his shotgun until his knuckles turned white, listening to the sound of glass shattering directly above his head. The intruder was in. He heard the man drop onto the attic floorboards, a heavy, triumphant sound. The sounds began to change. Silas listened to the frantic pacing of the intruder as he searched for a hatch that no longer existed. But then, the footsteps stopped. There was a long, suffocating silence that seemed to suck the oxygen out of the hallway. It was followed by a sound Silas will never forget. A muffled, terrified whine that wasn't human. It was a high-pitched sound of absolute, soul-shattering fear, like someone seeing their own death reflected in the dark. Then came the thud, thud, thud of a terrified scramble. The masked man didn't just leave. He threw himself back out the roof window and tumbled down the shingles, fleeing in pure, unadulterated terror from whatever had reached out from the cemented dark to greet him. Silas stayed awake for the rest of the night, sitting in a chair in the middle of the living room. He didn't watch the door anymore. He watched the ceiling. He spent hours listening to the heavy, dragging footsteps that remained trapped above his head, moving back and forth with a slow, rhythmic patience. He felt an unsettling, nauseating gratitude for the thing in the attic. It had protected him, but he knew its loyalty was non-existent. It hadn't saved him out of kindness. It was merely a bigger predator defending its cage from a smaller one. Have you ever felt thankful for something that terrified you? It's a psychological scar that doesn't heal. Silas sold that cabin a month later, but he says he still hears that dragging sound in his dreams. That realization that you might be sharing your sanctuary with a monster is a weight that changes how you look at every shadow in your own home. If you're watching this and thinking about buying a fixer-upper in the mountains, maybe check the attic first. And if you see cement where there should be wood, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell if you want to hear more about the hidden history of these ridges. We're uncovering things the state maps don't show. Leave a comment. What's the creepiest thing you've ever found in an old house? I want to know if Silas is the only one, because sometimes the only thing more dangerous than a stranger on your porch is the one you can't see, the one waiting for a wrong turn or a moment of overconfidence. The road home is a long one, and as we will see in the next story, a wrong turn in the snow can lead you directly into the hands of someone who has been waiting a very long time for a passenger. They say never pick up hitchhikers, but what happens when the hitchhiker is the one behind the wheel? Let's talk about the carpenter of the ridge, the carpenter's kit. The road home is a long one, and as we have seen, a wrong turn in the snow can lead you directly into the hands of someone who has been waiting a very long time for a passenger. It was 3 days before Christmas, and the arrogance of trying to beat a mountain blizzard was a mistake that nearly cost me my life. Have you ever been so focused on reaching your destination that you ignored the world, literally screaming at you to stop? That was me in the winter of 2001. I was driving from North Carolina up to the deepest parts of West Virginia, convinced that my sedan could handle the whiteout corridor of the Appalachian ridges. My knuckles were white on the steering wheel, and my breath fogged the windshield as the temperature plummeted. I had ignored every flashing warning sign, every instinctual alarm, until the snow became so thick that the world outside was just a swirling, lightless void. Eventually, the road vanished, and I found myself stranded on an exposed shoulder, the wind rocking my car like a toy. I sat there in the dark for what felt like hours, staring into the abyss, realizing that if my engine failed, I would die in that seat. The silence of a stalled car in a blizzard is a terrifying thing. It's the sound of the universe deciding you don't matter, like a phantom appearing through the mist. A set of headlights cut through the storm. It was a massive, weathered truck, a four-wheel drive beast that looked like it was built for this nightmare. For a second, I felt a rush of pure, unadulterated relief. But as the vehicle slowed and the driver lowered his window, that relief was instantly replaced by a sharp, instinctive twist in my gut. Have you ever looked at someone and felt a wrongness you couldn't logically explain? The man looked normal enough a carpenter, judging by the tools and sawdust in the back, but his eyes were empty, and his smile was a manufactured mask of friendliness that didn't reach his face. He offered me a ride, and despite the alarm bells screaming in my head, the prospect of freezing to death made me climb into the cab. If you're ever in this situation, listen to your gut, not your fear of the cold. The moment I shut the door, the atmosphere changed. He started talking immediately, filling the small space with a manufactured friendliness that felt like it was rehearsed 1,000 times. He didn't ask if I was okay. He asked if anyone knew exactly where I was. He circled around the question repeatedly, like a predator testing a fence. Does your family have your GPS location? Are they expecting you in 30 minutes or 2 hours? Is anyone actually on the road looking for you right now? My pulse began to thud in my ears, a rhythmic, frantic warning. I realized that if I told the truth that I was alone and no one expected me until morning, I was a dead man. I lied. I told him my father and brother, two very large, very well-armed men with local law enforcement ties, were already on the road in a heavy-duty truck, trailing my phone signal. I even pretended to check a non-existent GPS app. I saw a micro-expression of annoyance flicker across his face, a twitch of the lip that broke his oily grin for just a split second. This was a man with a plan, and my lie had just hit a snag. The tension reached a breaking point when we reached the fork in the road. To the left lay the town, safety, and the local hospital. To the right lay the hunting land's miles of uninhabited forest, vertical drops, and long stretches of nothingness where sound goes to die. He turned right. I asked why, my voice tight with a fear I could no longer hide. He gave a smooth, practiced explanation about a safer alternate route, known only to locals to avoid a supposed jackknifed semi-truck on the main road. I knew better. I had grown up in these hills, exploring every logging road and deer trail. That road didn't lead to town. It led to a graveyard of abandoned cabins and frozen creek beds. I realized then that I wasn't a passenger. I was a target in a mobile hunting blind. I needed to get him to stop the truck before we reached the deep woods, where he could do whatever he wanted without interruption. I feigned a medical emergency, a desperate, gasping performance about a sudden, violent reaction to a medication that required me to step out immediately. He hesitated, his eyes darting to the locked door handle and then to the road, weighing his options. Eventually, he pulled over onto a dark, snow-choked shoulder, thinking I was too weak to run. The second the truck slowed, I didn't run away. I bolted for the back storage compartment. I had seen him lock the cab, but the external toolboxes on a carpenter's truck are often left on a simple latch for quick access. I prayed it was unlocked. It was. As I lifted the heavy metal door, my heart nearly stopped. Nestled among the saws and wood scraps was the carpenter's kit, neatly coiled nylon rope, rolls of industrial-strength duct tape, several cans of accelerant, and a heavy, stained tarp. This wasn't a professional's toolbox. It was a predator's preparation. There was even a small digital camera tucked into the corner. My stomach turned. I heard him shout, a guttural, angry sound that replaced his manufactured friendliness. I heard the sound of his boots crunching in the deep snow as he rounded the truck, his face no longer smiling, but contorted into something feral and hungry. My hand searched the shadows of the tool bin and closed around the heavy wooden butt of a shotgun, Julian's old defensive weapon that I had noticed earlier. As he lunged for me, his fingers reaching for my throat, I swung with every ounce of survival instinct I possessed. The wood connected with the side of his head with a sickening thud, and he collapsed into the snow, his headlamp spinning across the white ground. I didn't think. I moved. Panic can either paralyze you or turn you into a machine. I used my Boy Scout training to secure him with his own rope, tying him to the backseat of his own truck with knots that wouldn't slip no matter how much he struggled. The drive to my parents' house was an agonizing gauntlet of adrenaline and terror. Every time the truck bumped over a pothole or the wind shook the frame, I expected him to wake up, to find a way to reach through the seat, get the shotgun on the passenger side, my hand never leaving the grip. When I finally pulled into the driveway, the headlights reflecting off the snow-covered porch, my brother was already outside, alerted by the unfamiliar vehicle. He took one look at the man tied in the back and his face went pale. Then hard as flint, he recognized him. This was a man the locals knew as the Carver, a carpenter from 2 counties over with a dark, whispered reputation for near-miss encounters with tourists and hikers that the police could never quite prove because there were never any witnesses. My brother and father didn't call the police immediately. They knew the law sometimes has its hands tied by lack of evidence. They took the truck back to a secluded ridge, left the man with a mountain warning that he would never forget, and a threat that ensured he would disappear from the state by morning if he valued his life. 15 years have passed now. I still don't drive in the snow if I can help it. And I never, ever pick up a stranger. That night taught me that the whiteout corridor hides more than just the road. It hides people who have spent their lives learning how to disappear, and how to make others disappear with them. If you are traveling through the mountains this season, keep your doors locked and your tank full. Don't be the one who trusts a manufactured smile just because the heater is on. Hit that like button if you've ever had a gut feeling save your life, and share this with anyone heading out on a winter road trip. The Appalachians are beautiful, but they are also ancient, and they have a way of remembering the people who didn't make it home. We've covered the intruders, the stalkers, and the predators of the road. But for our final story, we must return to where it all began, to the legends that aren't human at all. Because while men can be monsters, the mountains themselves sometimes birth things that even the carpenters of the ridge are afraid to name. Let's look at the creature that has been watching the same house every New Year's Eve for 40 years. It's waiting for the light to go out. Are you ready? Let's finish this. The long shadow of the Appalachians. The road home is a long one, and as we have seen, a wrong turn in the snow can lead you directly into the hands of someone who has been waiting a very long time for a passenger. They say never pick up hitchhikers, but what happens when the hitchhiker is the one behind the wheel? That night on the ridge changed how I view every friendly face I encounter in the wild. But as terrifying as the Carver was, he was still human. He was a monster, made of flesh, blood, and bad intentions. There are other things in these mountains, things that have existed long before the first road was carved into the granite, and they have an ancient patience that humans simply cannot comprehend. I'm talking about the Appalachian legacy, the shadow that doesn't belong to a tree or a man. I grew up in a house tucked so deep into the West Virginia peaks that the forest didn't just surround the property. It felt like it owned it. Trees pressed against the porch like curious observers, their branches scratching at the siding whenever the wind picked up. As a kid, you learn to identify the normal sounds of the mountain. You know the difference between the heavy snap of a bear's footstep and the light, frantic rustle of a squirrel. But every New Year's Eve, there was a sound that didn't fit. My first memory of it was from when I was 9 years old. I remember waking up in the dead of night, the house silent, except for the rhythmic ticking of the hallway clock. I looked out my bedroom window toward the tree line where the porch light barely reached. I saw a shape moving slowly along the perimeter drift. It wasn't walking like an animal. It moved with a strange, sideways gait, almost like it was gliding. It was tall, unnaturally tall, and its proportions were all wrong. Its limbs were too long and narrow, as if they had been stretched beyond their limits. I remember opening the window, fueled by a child's lack of fear, and yelling something into the dark. The creature stopped. It lifted its head, looking straight into my eyes with a gaze that felt like a bucket of ice water being poured down my spine, and then it simply slipped back into the Monongahela shadows. My parents dismissed it as an overactive imagination, but I saw the look on my grandfather's face. He knew. He told me to stop talking about it, to let it be a memory that fades. But some memories don't fade. They just wait for the right moment of isolation. The apparition is a recurring nightmare that has haunted my family for generations. Every New Year's Eve, like clockwork, the perimeter drift is disturbed by something that doesn't belong to the local fauna. New Year's Eve of 2024 was supposed to be a warm family affair. The house was full of laughter. The TV was blaring, and the kitchen smelled of wood smoke and cedar. Mid-evening, I started feeling a strange, heavy lethargy, a weight in my limbs that felt like the mountain itself was pressing down on me. I decided to lie down in my old bedroom, listening to the muffled sounds of my family through the walls. I drifted into that half-sleep where the world feels fluid. where the boundaries between memory and reality began to blur. Suddenly, I snapped awake. That familiar sense of alertness hit me, the prickle on the skin that says you aren't alone. It was the same feeling I had when I was 9. I turned my head toward the window. There it was, the same misshapen proportions I had seen as a child. It was emerging from between the oaks, exactly where it had appeared decades ago. It moved along the edge of the forest, circling the house with an ancient patience that was terrifying to behold. It wasn't trying to get in. It was studying the house. It seemed to understand where the noise was coming from, where the warmth was concentrated. It was as if it was taking a census of everyone inside, counting the heartbeats through the log walls. I stayed frozen, my heart pounding against my ribs like a trapped bird, until it locked its gaze onto mine through the glass. Its eyes weren't human. They were pits of ancient, freezing dark. It vanished into the trees. I rejoined my family and said nothing. I already knew how the story ended when you tried to tell the truth about the mountains you were labeled as touched or imaginative. As I sit here at the end of 2025, getting ready for New Year's Eve of 2026, I am truly alone in this house for the first time. The family is scattered this year, different plans, different states, different lives. I told myself I didn't mind the solitude, that a quiet night by the fire was exactly what I needed. But as the sun dips below the ridge and the light fades from the snow, I find myself drawn to the windows. I keep checking the tree line, watching for that perimeter drift. I know it's coming back. It's been waiting all these years for this specific moment, the moment when I would finally be isolated, when there would be no one else to hear a scream or witness a disappearance. The silence of the house is deafening. Every creak of the floorboard sounds like an invitation. I've barricaded the doors, just like Julian did at his cabin, but I know that some things don't need a door to get in. They don't even need a window. They just wait for you to look into the dark long enough that the dark starts looking back. The Appalachian legacy isn't a story. It's a debt that the mountains eventually collect. There's a chilling realization that comes with living in these peaks. The mountains respect no one. Not your fences, not your locks, and certainly not your misplaced sense of safety. Whether the danger is a man with a carpenter's kit or a tall, misshapen shadow that glides through the pines with ancient patience, the winter ridge is a place where you are always on the menu. The cold isn't just around you. If you stay out here long enough, it gets inside you, sapping your will to run until you're just another part of the forest floor. Thank you for joining me for these tales of Appalachian horror. These stories are more than just entertainment. They are a record of the things we try to forget when the sun comes up. If you've enjoyed this compilation, please hit the like button and share your own mountain stories in the comments below. Have you ever seen something that defied logic in the deep woods? Have you ever felt a presence watching you from the edge of the light? I want to hear about it before the power goes out tonight. Your stories are the only thing that keeps the darkness at bay. Subscribe to Dread Shadow for more deep dives into the dark. We have a full year of chilling narratives planned for 2026, and I want you there for every single one of them. Share this video with a friend who thinks they're tough enough for a winter hike. Maybe it'll save them from a wrong turn. Stay warm, stay alert, and whatever you do, don't look out the window tonight. If you hear a glide against the siding, or a soft, rhythmic thud against the glass, just keep your eyes on the fire. Don't let it see that you're awake. Here's to surviving 2026 together. The mountains are watching. They have been watching since before we had names. Are you ready to face what's waiting in the perimeter drift? I hope so, because out here, the only thing more dangerous than being lost is being found by the wrong thing. Good night, and stay safe.